Welcome everyone to this episode of the Frontier Culture Museum's lecture series. My name is Doretta Sobolewski and I'm the research coordinator here at the museum. And today I'm delighted to have Dr. Raphael, Chijioke, and Njoku with me, who will speak about Igbo West African masquerade culture and the dynamics of the African Diaspora Carnivals. Before I introduce Dr. Njoku, I would like to thank the American Frontier Culture Foundation for supporting this lecture series. With their help, we're able to offer programs like this lecture series free to you. And if you would like to share your passion and your appreciation for educational programs like this lecture series, please consider giving to the foundation. We try to make it easy for you, so if you'd like to donate, there's a donate button on our website in the lower left corner, or if you're watching this video on our YouTube channel, there's also a link included in the comment section below. So thank you so much. And now it is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker, Dr. Njoku. Raphael Chijioke Njoku, African history professor at Idaho State University, received a doctorate in African history from Dalhousie University in Canada in 2003, and a doctorate in political science from the Vrije Universiteit in Belgium in 2001. His research specialty is intellectual history, African Igbo history, especially cultural history, decolonization, African diaspora studies, African politics, and globalization studies. He is the author of West African Masking Traditions and African Diaspora Masquerade Carnivals, History, Memory, and Transnationalism, published by the University of Rochester Press in 2020. And United States and Africa Relations, 1400s to the Present, published by Yale University Press, also in 2020. Dr. Njoku has published 12 books and 45 articles in academic journals and edited volumes. He's currently the chair of the Department of Global Studies and Languages at Idaho State University. So welcome, Professor Njoku, and thank you so much for being here today with me. Before we get started, I just wanted to mention to our viewers that this talk is based on your book, West African Masking Traditions and African Diaspora Masquerade Carnivals, History, Memory, and Transnationalism, with Rochester University Press, which was published last year. And a digital copy of the book has been made available for free by the generous support of the Andrew W. Mellon Foundation. And we'll make sure to include the link in the description below this video. So can you tell us a little what got you interested in African masquerade traditions?
Thank you very much. First of all, I have to thank you for finding me out and inviting me to this wonderful lecture. It's my honor to be your guest. Directly related to your question, you know, it's been a long journey. And I think you will find it a little more interesting. So let me start by saying that I grew up in a family environment where I was surrounded by masquerades and elders who were really organizers of the masquerade tradition in my hometown. I was also surrounded by dancers and teachers of dance, uncles, nephews, aunts. It was just amazing. My compound, or what we call compound or family environment, was a kind of a mobile theater, and I see things before others see it, because when they prepare for the masquerade and the public presentations during Christmas time, they usually do it in secret, under the cover of the dark and during moonlight. So others outside my compound don't see what is going on until it was Christmas time. Anyway, but growing up then in the 70s and 80s, it was just part of life. I didn't think it was something special. So it wasn't until I came to North America, and then I saw carnivals in Toronto, in New Orleans, and read a little more about diaspora, mask and carnivals. And I say, hey, I think I know what this means. And I think this came from our home area, and they are doing it a little bit differently here, but I can also see changes and commonalities. So I started getting interested in masquerades and carnivals of the diaspora in terms of, academic study of it. So in 2007, 2006, 2007, I wrote a proposal to the Schomburg Center in Harlem, proposing to study African masque and the masquerades of the diaspora. And I got it's a very prestigious uh, award. I got it. I spent time at Harlem, studying carnivals of the diaspora and their masquerades. And then the writing took me a little time, but the challenge was how to fine tune the connection and provide a timeline. So that was where the challenge was. And I made several presentations in academic circles. And each time I remember very well, experts in the field will say, okay, how do you prove your case? How do you tell us how masquerade was in the pre-colonial times, like 1500, even earlier than 1500 and 1600 and 1700 and so on. So that was what took me a lot of time, but I was well prepared to finally solve the riddle and then write the book. And luckily, Rochester University Press was very much interested in the book, and we now have a book.
Which I'm really grateful for as someone who is trying to learn more about how Igbo culture impacted African American and American culture as well. So I'm really looking forward to your talk.
Excellent.
Thank you for explaining that to us.
Sure. So if we start, so I'm going to share my screen with you. I might not get into details of everything on the screen because of time and because of the audience, but I will provide my email. If anybody has questions in the future, one has some kind of follow-up questions or whatever, I'm always free to correspond with the person and answer some of the questions.
Perfect, that's great. And we'll make sure we include your email address in the bottom of the comment section as well.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you.
So this is where we start. Just to mention briefly the scope of my presentation and the content. So I'm going to start with a general introduction, and then we talk about origins and symbols of the masquerade culture in Africa. And then we talk about the internal and diasporic diffusions. We cover entertainment aspect, music, dance, and drama. And then look at changes under slavery and colonialism. We remember colonialism in the New World and colonialism in Africa as well. And then finally, we'll mention a little bit about narratology, memory, and remembering, because that's what all the Masquerade Carnival is all about, whether we are talking about how it plays out in Africa and how it plays out in the diaspora. One thing is constant, despite the drama, music, and dance and the jamboree, there is always a story behind a masquerade dance. Participants and the partakers are politically engaged. Some of them use masquerade to pursue social justice and to protest against oppression. So that was happening in Africa, and the culture was brought over to the African diaspora, particularly the Americas. Okay, so this is where my research focused mostly, and part of what also motivated me was that I took a visit to West Africa in 2010, and I was in Gambia, I was in Senegal, I was in Mali, and I saw similar things, even though they do them separately, even though these areas are mostly Muslim societies today. Even in Mali, where 95% of the citizens are Muslims, you still see masquerades. And when I saw the Solomon masquerade, it looks like the same masquerade, some of the masquerades we have in my village. But we are talking about thousands of masquerade societies but I can see similarities, even though there are inhibitions put on, brought about by Islam, but the people still cherish those time-honored culture. And I started putting things together, and I said, I'm going to investigate a lot more about this. So let me show you where the Igbo are.
Professor Njoku, sorry for interrupting, but could you share the screen in the presentation style so that the visitors can see the map a little bigger?
Sure, absolutely.
Yeah.
So let me see. So where do I go for
It's a slideshow.
Okay.
No, hang on. Let me.
Okay, great.
Perfect.
So this is the center of my research back in Africa, where I conducted most of the anthropological data gathering. So here is where we call the Bight of Biafra. And this is a historical trading emporium. And in the context of this research, the Bight of Biafra and the hinterland figures very prominently. One, it is also the homeland of the Bantu people, those who are in Bantu studies, which was the area where culture in terms of mixing of African peoples across different regions of the world, across different regions of the continent began somewhere about 3500 BC and 2500 BC. And if we look at the Igbo location here, and we see that the Igbo were also part of the Calabar zone, because some part of the Igbo were called Igbo Calabar. Their neighbors were the Bibio and the Efik, and of course here is Western Cameroon, Douala, and where you have the Ekoi people. And then we have the Ijo people here, where you also found significant Igbo population. And then we have the Gala here, northern Igbo is the Gala area, where you also find significant Igbo population. But the point I want to draw here is that the Bantu people original homeland was located between southeastern Nigeria and western Cameroon. And this is where you find the Igbo, the Bibio, the Ekoi, and the Njaban and others. So very important area. So besides the Bantu migration, this area also played central role during the transatlantic slave trade. So the Bight of Biafra was the major embarkation area taking African slaves to the New World. But the point I want to make here is that when you look at other studies, they try to differentiate between who was Igbo, who was Ibibio, who was Efik, who was Ekoi, who was Ijo. In the pre-colonial times, those concepts were not really very obvious, especially for border communities. They intermarried, they exchanged curiosities, they exchanged culture, they traded. They were just like, every village was like a nation unto itself, in as much as societies were fluid. And one other thing I want to mention here is that these societies, especially the Igbo and the Ibibio, were very democratic in their political systems. So they use what we call today village republicanism. And in that system, there was no centralization of power. The point is that it was a classic form of democracy. In fact, more democratic than what we call the Greek Acropolis, where we say democracy originated. But the Igbos were even more democratic than the Greek. So here comes how the masquerade culture figured in. And I'm going to explain this more as we proceed. So it was more or less like finding groups of associations that will also participate in the democratic system. Part of these were what we call the age grade systems, where people born, for instance, within 5-year group will form a company, what some people call company or age groups, and they grow up together. And as they grow up, they participate in different aspects of governance, whether it is policing or cleaning the village square or burial or other construction works for the community. So they grow from being young boys to youth and old men and so on and so forth. So this is where the masquerade culture came in. So those masquerade cultures were actually part of the age group, but they are called also masquerade companies. So they were intricate part of the social, cultural, political system. Okay, so again, I want to use this map to illustrate something as well, which is very controversial, especially when we talk about the Bantu and the Bantu family of languages. So when you look at the previous studies on the Bantu, the Igbo, Ijo, and Nupe people are classified under the Kwa branch of the language, and the Edo, Efik, and Tiva and Ibibio are classified under the Benue Congo branch. Again, this might be correct, but in my own thinking, and several experts have said the same thing, especially Adiola Fibo, who is like the dean of Igbo studies. I mean, nobody beats Adiola Fibo in the world when it comes to this kind of conceptualization and verification of historical ideas. He also tells us that Cross River Igbo, there is several Igbo communities, and they are like in their hundreds over here, close to Efik and Ibibio communities, that their languages are the same. And I'm part of this language, and I've investigated this language. They are more or less like Ibibio languages and Efik languages. So it's not really correct to differentiate between Efik and Ibibio and Igbo and put them in different classes, even though they all belong to the Niger-Congo larger language family. But when you speak the language and understand the language and understand all the different dialects, then you appreciate the point I'm trying to make here, that the colonial officers who started this language might not be really correct. And they admitted that this is, a new study for them. They might be wrong. So that's the point I want to make, because somebody who will be reading the book or looking at this lecture will say, oh, but Igbo is not in the same family of languages or subgroup of languages with Ibibio and Ijo. My emphatic response here is that, yes, part of the Igbo language is the same. Several dialects of the Igbo language is almost the same with Ibibio and Efik, and their cultures are the same. That's why they are called Cross River Igbo. In the Cross River Basin area, it was, and it still is similar culture. Okay, in general, masquerade carnivals in Africa are part of the African art. So we call them visual art or theoretical arts. But overall, African arts are a means to an end. Whether we are talking about carved images or these mobile theoretical art forms, they are all a means to an end, unlike in the Western understanding of art, where a piece of art is something you admire, it's an end in itself. African art is a symbol, a representation for something larger than what we see. And this is where we should be able to understand the masquerade culture a little more deeper. So in the African system, arts are used to commemorate mythical forebearers, ancestors, heroes, people who live their life in a way that amazes society. in Washington and Virginia area, we talk about those monuments that they have erected everywhere. And in the African system, they convocate masquerades and arts to represent and remember these heroes and ancestors or forebearers who have done very, very stuff to be proud of in the pre-colonial society. It is also a symbolic representation of rituals. So when you look at the traditional religion, the paraphernalia of the traditional religion is replete with all forms of art, whether arts publishing cloth as media or those with iron or wood or whatever media they choose to publish it. These are forms of representations of ritual. They also serve as group emblems. They represent, like in the Akan system, where the golden stool served as a collective power of the society. And also, of course, the obvious is there. The masquerade and dances are for entertainment, and of course, they provide aesthetic appeals. So this is where we transit to the masquerade presentation. So the convocation of those masquerades were also part of the African art culture. Okay, so I did mention about political administration. That was one of the primary purposes of masquerades in the bite of Biafra hinterland. And here I'm talking about the Igbo, the Efik, the Ibibio, the Ijo people, the Ekoi people of Cameroon. The primary purpose of masquerades was for political administration. And let me explain this in a way those who are not familiar with African history will understand it. So we are talking about a very fluid society where democracy was paramount. And this presented a lot of challenges. So this presented a lot of challenges. There was no centralization of power. There was no centralized police force or army. So in that kind of political environment, you can just imagine what will happen. People can go crazy sometimes. People can commit murder because there is no police and there was no 911 to dial to come and rescue people in times of emergency. So what the elders did was to come up with this idea that the ancestors, the dead ancestors, are always watching those who are living, and that they come from the dead to visit the living, bring blessings or bring punishment to the living. So this was how the kind of ideology they came up with as a form of political administration. So that's why the Bantu hinterland, Proto-Bantu hinterland people began to articulate this whole notion of ancestral masquerades, how they were going to clothe them, dress them up, cover their faces, and of course, arm them with the authority and power to punish offenders, those who contravene the law, especially the natural laws. People who commit adultery, people who steal other people's property, people who kidnap. And you can imagine what will happen if there was nothing to checkmate all those antisocial behaviors. So this is where the masquerade became a very important form of political administration. So let's assume that there was a thief in the community and everybody, after investigation, they identified the individual who committed the offense. The masquerades will visit at night, knock on your door, pick up the culprit, and punish the culprit. So if you look at the picture here, it came to a point during the colonial period where you have what they called, early colonial period where you have what they call the ghost police. So they dress like policemen, carry some kind of weapons, and everybody knew that if you're running around with other married women, they warn you once, they warn you twice, because they don't want you to create chaos in society. They come at night and pick up the culprit for punishment. Those who committed heinous crimes like murder, they could kill them at night, bury them, and in the morning the word will spread that the ghost police, the ancestral spirits came at night and made away with that evil man, and he's gone forever. Nobody will ask about him anymore. So that was how they were able to keep order, social control, even when they practice this unrestricted democratic culture. Now, another part of the political administration, which I have to mention, is also the which is also part of the political administration, is also the narratology and act of remembering. So masquerades are convocated as a technique of remembering history, what happened in the past. But at the same time, the masquerades were also serving as a kind of a check on excessive power of the elders. So if you look at the Ulaga masquerade here on the left, when it comes out in the public square, and we have a saying that if the king, if the chief became too authoritarian, then we put on the Ulaga masquerade and talk to him. So if you put on the Ulaga masquerade, you can talk to anybody without fear. And the king or chief would be just so nervous that there is nothing, absolutely nothing he will do to you. I think the French have similar culture when you go to the, what do you call it? The square where, you know, you can pull your shirt, tear your shirt, criticize the government, and then you come out, but nobody will arrest you so far as you're around that square. But once you come out, then the police can arrest you. But with the Ulaga, no, you dare not arrest the Ulaga masquerade. There were also places among the Bibio, like the Wana people, for instance, where individuals can really go to the market square. So far as they are within that square, they can talk to anybody, condemn any social practice, and nobody will touch you because we are standing on freedom grounds. So that's part of the political administration of the masquerade in the traditional African society. Okay, I also want to mention this because it's very important when we talk about Igbo masquerade, Efik masquerade, Ibibio masquerade, and other masquerades, like the Yoruba masquerade they call the Gelede masquerade. The Gelede masquerade is very interesting. And during my study, I came to know a little more about it. In the context of narratology and remembering, the Gelede masquerade was convocated during the transatlantic slave trade. And you find this very interesting. So if you look at the picture on the left, so that's the image of a woman. So they carved this image, but also they performed this masquerade dance. So the masquerade represented women, but it was not performed by women. It was performed by men. What happened was that during the transatlantic slave trade, women were so depressed because they regularly lost their children, and they grieve about this loss. And the men came together to cheer the women up. They convocated this masquerade as part of that loss and the process of cheering the women up. And the men would dress like women and dance with them and beat the dance. It became a festival. And during the period, women are a lot more relieved and they will dance with the men and celebrate the occasion with men. Again, but when the Gelede masquerade performs, we are remembering. Remembrance about slave trade, the losses, the pains, especially how it affected women. Okay, and I have talked about entertainment. Of course, not all masquerades were for entertainment, but many of them were. And again, it was part of the souls of the various societies and communities and masquerade cults that perform these dances. They will come out during New Yam Festival, during burial, during naming ceremony for the newborn baby, during all kinds of initiation rituals, rites of passage to commemorate those events. And the community will come together to eat and drink and celebrate and invite friends to come to these festivals. Finally, let me mention this about socialization, and I've touched on it briefly when we started. So here you see the boys masquerade play, and you can guess the age of these boys. Most of them were like um, 2, 3, 4, 5 years old. So they start early to socialize the next masquerade cult, the next masquerade group. And I myself, I passed through these processes because I grew up in the village while my parents were in big cities working, and my elder siblings as well. But I was with my grandmother. So that's why I learned a lot about all these societies and their activities. They teach you how to make the mask yourself, and I can make some myself, including the addresses and paraphernalia. And then what was happening was that, for instance, during Christmas period, is it was either we wait the adult masquerades finish up with their activities and performances, and then the little boys will start doing theirs, or we do the hours earlier before the masquerade season begins. So this was how younger people were raised and socialized and then trained to take over when the elder ones retire. But I tell you one thing, in as much as early as possible, 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, we already know about this. When the original masquerade comes out, you run away because you can't even stand it. And I'm telling you, it was so frightening, even till today, when these angry masquerades, like the one we see on the right side, come out. No matter who you are, you lose your courage, run inside, bang the door, and close the windows, because you never know their mission, whether they were going to beat up somebody, arrest somebody, or um, do something in secret. You just have to stay out of their way, because that's what the culture demands. Okay, so I'm thinking that I shouldn't spend much time on the origins, but I want to be very clear. I am not saying that masquerades, masking carnivals began in the Igbo hinterland or the Bight of Biafra hinterland. Nobody can say for sure. And my research showed that the Japanese had their own masquerade carnivals. In ancient Egypt, we have seen masquerade carnivals, and um, among the Inca people, there were masquerade carnivals. Among the Native Americans, there were similar cultures. So that was why I used the concept of depolarization or repolarization to explain this concept that rituals related to masquerade or masquerade rituals were part of the broader interfaces of religion. And the essence of religion, whether in the ancient times or medieval times or in the modern times or today's society, is to use the fear of God to regulate society, to bring sanity, and to moderate human behavior. So all these ideas were there across human societies. It was not peculiar to Africa. Even in Islam, even before the Islamic period in the Arabian world, similar things were also in play. In fact, the word masquerade was part of an Islamic syntax. So I want to be very clear so that somebody who is hearing this will not say, oh, how does he claim that masquerade began in Africa. The Europeans also had their own masquerade culture. And I did mention all this in my book in a very nuanced and contextualized form. But I'm going to explain why the African masquerade, the Igbo bite of Biafra masquerade was unique and what distinguishes it from the others. I've already touched briefly on that, but I'm going to elaborate on that very soon. So I've talked about how it was a form of social control and to maintain order in decentralized society. Generally, when you look at the African cosmology, again, those masquerades were convocated as a representation of the ancestors. And in the African traditional religion, ancestors matter a lot. They are connected with the Mother Earth, the Earth deity. Even though the Africans believe in the existence of the high God, the creator God, the idea was the ancestors were the intermediaries between God and man. They were the go-between. The Africans believed that God created the world and then resided in heaven and then left the ancestors to mediate between God and man. So the ancestors loomed large in the African cosmology, and elders invoked them to bring unprecedented fear in the hearts of men and women. And through this invocation of fear, because you don't want to invoke the wrath of the ancestors, people behave the way society wanted them to behave. So another aspect of it is that in the African world, we have what we call the pairing of concepts. And I think it is similar around the world, but the Africans were very clear about this concept, especially the Igbo. They believe in this bifurcation ideology, the idea that everything exists in two, men, women, good, bad, evil, good, tall, short. So for them, evil exists alongside good, and both create a kind of balance. It's a kind of balancing act. You cannot have one without the other. So it was also within this symbolism that the masquerade society, according to some theories, was created to counterbalance the act of witchcraft. And when you look at the literature, scholars have come up with all kinds of theories. So the first one is this power balancing theory to counter witchcraft. And the narrative is that women were having the upper hand in witchcraft, and they used witchcraft to torment men and their enemies. So the elders came together to use masquerades to counter this upper hand women had. So they call it the power balancing theory. But my argument is that that is just a simplistic way of explaining the functions of masquerade, because it was not only, witchcraft was not only one of the ills, the only ill of society. There were so many ills of society, robbery, poisoning, adultery, and so on and so forth. So if we focus only on witchcraft practiced by women, what about wizardry practiced by men? So the power balancing theory, partly, but do not fully explain why and how masquerade originated. And I have gone through about performing social control functions, enforced discipline, and natural laws. So again, natural laws transcends witchcraft. There are all kinds of natural laws that were needed to be enforced. The second theory was the omnipresent theory, which emanates from the fact that the African world is cyclical and interdependent. This is what Marcia Eliade calls a myth of eternal return. So in the African cosmology, again, the Africans believe that ancestors are always traveling between the land of the dead and the land of the living, watching out what humans are doing, what their forebearers are doing, blessing or cursing them or punishing them or rewarding them. So it made sense for the Bight of Biafra hinterland people to create this masquerade culture and clothe it in a bodily form that will prove to the people physically, hey, the ancestors are here, not just the ghosts you cannot see, but they are here in physical form to enforce discipline. Okay, just briefly, I have few concepts to explain a little bit so that I don't sound redundant. I use the word in my book, nonlinear dynamics, to explain that when you are looking at historical questions with confusing timelines, and I'm saying this because I don't want to claim that the African masquerade came before the North American masquerade or the Egyptian masquerade or the Arabian masquerade or the Asian masquerade or the European masquerade, because we do not know. We don't have concrete timeline to prove that. All these societies had their forms of religions, forms of representations, and rituals. So that was why I said it's better we approach it in a non-linear dynamic. And the proponents of this dynamic, this theory, want us to, look at such concepts in a multifarious entities of a system, corporate, compete, and interface. So these various genres of masquerades, whether we are talking about African, Arabic, American, or Asian, European, I assume they were competing and they all had their own origins. And I don't want to privilege one over the other. And I also use the concept of depolarization and repolarization to again explain the masking phenomenon as part of the wider religious norm in which in diverse time and for various purposes, human beings, we are very inventive in terms of culture, and they came up with this theoretical or artistic representation of spirits in diverse form. Okay. Having created the context of how and why the masquerade was not about the Igbo or the Bibu or the Biafran hinterland, I'm now going to explain why the brand of masquerade that came from this area is unique. And that is in the physical creation of the mobile masquerade. If you look at the Native American masks in the museum down there in Washington, D.C., those masks don't have eyes. And they were not, the representation of the dead don't have eyes because they didn't believe that the dead will see after death. When you look at the ancient Egyptian masks, yeah, they had carnivals in ancient Egypt, and it was one of the first places that recorded carnivals are made. But if you look at their artistic work also, they did not clothe those representations so that they are mobile, so that they can speak, so that they can interact with the living. But in the Bight of Biafra hinterland, this is where this ingenuity began. In as much as we cannot put a date on when it began, my idea is that the people of that hinterland had already created this mobile masquerade, this mobile ancestral masquerade, before the Bantu migrations began. And that explains why, as the Bantus moved across sub-Saharan Africa. They were lending some of their culture and borrowing some of their culture. And another thing I want to add here is that in as much as we talk about the Igbo, we also have to realize that in the ancient times, my studies showed that people were moving more than we can imagine in the modern times, because there was no visa requirement. There was no border checks, and there was a lot of empty spaces. So people moved, migrations were very common. And my aunts and uncles tell me stories about people, stranger elements who moved into our village. I never knew, even as an adult, until I asked my mother. For instance, my mother will be 98 years in May. And she said, oh, didn't you know they were not originally members of this community? Oh, didn't you know the other family? I said, where did they come from? Therefore, they've been here for ages and nobody questions why they are there. So people were a lot more freer accepting non-members of their community because they needed people for defense. They needed people for protection. So movement was very fluid. And as people moved across regions, cultures were also very fluid. What I want to say here is that the Igbos, the Efik, the Ibibio, they were lending their culture and borrowing as well. So this physical creation of mobile masquerades began in this region. In terms of imagination, philosophical thought, artistic design, intricate costuming, laced with awe and absurdity, secrecy, humor, ritual observances. This was where it was born. And again, I'm saying maybe it was undergoing all kinds of fine-tuning, but this whole idea had already been created before the Bantu migrations began. Because people who were living with this memory and trying to remember them in alien societies. Now, whether they recreated them the way the Bight of Bantu people did is a different question altogether. And I have another proof for that. So when you go back to the Bight of Biafra hinterland, these masquerades are more powerful. They wield heavier political power. Everybody respect them. You can never attack them because their power was so much that they create awe, even in the heart of the most serious ruler or king or chief. But as you move from this Bantu original homeland into other parts of Africa, their powers lessen. They become more or less like entertainment presentations and jamborees. But when you move back to the point of origin, you see how the people revere them with awe and amount of religiosity they place in them. That is the way you have to conceptualize this. And we are going to see as the masquerade culture move into the diaspora, is going to become something different than what we have in the original homeland. Okay, the internal and diasporic diffusions. Again, I have to emphasize this. The Bantu migration routes provided an outlet for cultural diffusions. And again, people move out of a region and possibly come back. So I'm from Nigeria. I've been to different places. And as I'm speaking now, I'm also thinking about going back home. And over the years, I always try to visit home at least once to see my mom. When I'm at home, I tell them what I have seen in Belgium, what I have seen in Canada, what I have seen in America, in the United States. And we share these ideas and people borrow and lend. So the Bantu we are moving across these regions learning their culture, borrowing, going back home, moving out, never going back again. So it's very fluid, it's very dynamic, and things change. And the Igbo in particular have migrated in and out, out and in. So I don't want anybody listening to this to say, oh, he reviled Igbo culture. No, I'm not doing that in any way. I'm saying that ideas were fluid and spreading and mutating. And those who were modeling this culture might not, in many occasions, recreate the original because they have to make do with what they found in their new environment. And also, they have to consider their positions of power because in the original Bantu homeland, Masquerade cause wielded a lot of power. So when we study the diaspora masquerade version of masque and masquerade, I'm saying that we should study them in culture zones, use the culture zone approach, because changes were already going on before the start of the transatlantic slave trade. Africa was dynamic. There was a lot of changes. Haywood has told us that in the edited volume that in the Congo, in Central Africa, for instance, when Central African slaves were brought to the Americas, they already know Christianity. So they didn't learn Christianity primarily in North America. They already had elements of Christianity and notions of Christianity, and that colored what they practiced as culture and what they do not hold very dearly as culture. So changes were already going on before the transatlantic slave trade. And my argument is that these dynamics of change, which I call Bantuization, continued in the Americas in different settings to incorporate African practices from across different regions of Africa, American practices, Native American practices, European practices, all of them came together. Okay, just to use this map to quickly explain. So you see the roots of Bantu migration. Bantu study students always emphasize the movements across Central Africa and Southern Africa, but there were also, cultures passing on across West Africa. They don't show much of that as well, but when you go to Sierra Leone and observe their dances and masquerades, and you go to Mali, as I have mentioned, then you come to appreciate what I'm talking about. So then the transatlantic slave trade began, and hundreds of thousands and millions of Africans came to the New World. And they had to think of how to survive, and their cultures will impart the New World, and part of it was the masquerade culture, music and dance and drama. Okay, another concept I'm using to articulate how these masquerades played out in the New World is that we have to think in terms of multivalent susceptibility. And what I'm saying here is, unlike some of the books we read, like the one in Virginia, I don't want to mention names of authors so that they don't feel I'm trying to degrade their book. No, that's not my intention, because the essence of historical work is to make corrections and strengthen existing historiography. But some authors try to say, oh, they still dancing in Virginia Islands, the Igbo Keleke dance, for instance. Or the Jonkonu dance in Virginia, or masquerade in Virginia, or in Jamaica, or Barbados was Igbo, because there were higher number of Igbos in those areas. I say, okay, it might be, but we do not really know for sure, because the Igbos did not form an island of themselves in the diaspora. They interacted with other Africans. They intermarried with them. They borrowed from them, and those borrowed from them. And one other thing is that we are not even sure how much skilled in the masquerade culture some of these slaves were. Some of them were absolutely, but not all of them. Just like in my village, not everybody is a masquerade dancer, not everybody is a masquerade leader. And when you remember very well, most of the victims of the slave trade, some of them were minorities and vulnerable people who were taken advantage of by slave dealers and slave kidnappers. So we don't know the degree of their mastery of some of these cultures. But the fact is that they came with their memory. They have seen this practice before. They could remember things and they try to reenact them as much as possible. And I define people like that as culture modelers. So they had a prototype, just like we have in engineering design. So they have the prototype, but we are not sure that what they are designing should and should not be in conformity with the African version, because the environment is not the same. The purpose is not the same. And by the way, how do we always enjoy those carnival jamborees thinking that they were just for entertainment? No. My study shows that the primary utility of those dances and drama and music and carnivaleering was for survival. And you know that during Christmas time, that was when the slaves had a little bit of freedom, a fleeting freedom for a day or two or three to do whatever they want. And after that, the slave drivers and masters will go back to their work. So that little time allowed them to express themselves, to cajole and ridicule their masters. This is, again, where the narratology and remembering comes in to become a form of expression, a form of quest for social justice. And of course, they use their instruments, the musical instruments, to dramatize their expressions in these forums. And when you look at the literature and the studies, they tell us which instruments came from Africa. The fact is that music and dance is Africa's gift to humanity. There is no doubt about that. When I was a student, I attended a lecture at George Mason University, and this expert in music and dance told us that 99% of music and dance we have today came from Africa. There is no doubt about it was Africa's gift to humanity. But the point I want to emphasize here is that even those musical instruments we have today, when you conduct your research, the prototypes came from Africa. Whether you are talking about tos or banjo or horns or banza, as they call them in Central Africa, they came from Africa. But under the European technological know-how, these are modernized and we now use electricity and power to operate them, but the prototypes actually came from Africa. So the Africans in diaspora, in terms of music and dance and masquerade, they were cultural modelers. They were modeling culture and trying to reinvent what their memory could allow them, their memory and skill could allow them to reenact. And the other part of it also we have to remember is that they had no power. They had no political power. So it was almost impossible for them to use the masquerades to wield the same power those in the African hinterlands wielded. So within the little space, the Europeans and the slave owners, the plantation owners who held the actual power, within the little space they allowed them, they tried to make use of the opportunities open for them to quest for their freedom. Okay, I want to show a little bit this Zulu masquerade dance. The point I want to make here is that when you look at the dance of the diaspora, the carnival jamborees and the dances. You see similar steps from Africa, but many of them have been modernized. Those masquerade players, those masquerade participants were at the same time the best dancers in Africa, because you cannot wear a masquerade if you cannot dance. So the choice of who wears the masquerade was equal to the best in the land. And I have this just video of the Zauli masquerade, just 2 minutes, and then we get back to the presentation and then finish up. So here you see some of the best dances we have seen. Yes, sir. Okay, so I didn't want to waste much time with that, since our audience can get some of these on Zoom, but the masquerades were some of the best dancers. Their entertainment was for real. People come out in the open to watch them, and they enjoy themselves, and they remember what transpired in the village squares. Okay, so let me briefly comment about what Colin Palmer calls cultural accretion. So the question is, in the diaspora, you have hundreds of Africans from different ethnic groups. But when the need arises, they came together to participate in these dances and dramas and masquerades. So how was it possible? Even those from the Akan region, for instance, which the literature tells us that they had no masquerade culture. How was it that the Akan immediately in the diaspora, whether it's in Virginia or Virgin Island or in the Congo Square, identified with these masquerade dances and carnivals? Colin Palmer tells us about that this is the function of cultural accretion. So in a cultural accretion, practices or ideas from others could always easily be adapted so far as they don't really modify the existing core belief in any significant way. You know, just like you say you are a Catholic, but when you go to Greek Orthodox Church, you see that they also talk about Virgin Mary, and they also talk about the saints. And you say, yeah, that's what we talk about in Catholic Church. It doesn't modify my belief, so I can spend the whole day here worshiping with the Greek Orthodox Church, you know, something like that. So in the African diaspora, the Africans commonly identify with ancestors who in the indigenous system served as intermediaries between God and man. And these masquerades were part of that intermediary. So they easily identified with them. And that was why it was common for all of them to participate. But the larger problem was that all of them were in bondage and they were vying for their freedom. And these cultural expressions provided them outlets for survival and forums to agitate for their freedom. So changes under slavery and colonial rule, and this is what I call the unmasking of the masquerade. So again, when the masquerades left the original homeland, their powers began to degrade. The entertainment utility remains strong. Other cultures were borrowing, but they were no longer wielders of enormous power outside their region, as in the Biafra hinterland. And then, because Islam came before Christianity in many parts of Africa, especially West Africa, Islam served as a counter ideology, because Islam doesn't accept representation of Allah in bodily forms or in any artistic form. So far as Islam takes precedence, it limited the performance of masquerade activities in those newly Islamic societies in Africa. But Muslim scholars agree, and a lot of them have written on these, that in as much as in pre-Islamic era, ideas of whether we are talking about 1001 nights in Arabic literature, or the existence of jinns and spirits in pre-Islamic Arabia, they admit that it was in Mali and in sub-Saharan Africa that a new form of ancestral ghostly notion, this masquerade notion, was invented, again giving ghosts bodily form, equipping them with voice, with drama, with agility, with dances, with costumes to run around and perform their activities. They admitted that it was in West Africa they saw this practice. And then under Christianity, whether we are talking about in the diaspora or in Africa, even in the Biafra hinterland, the masquerades were serious enemies of the colonial authorities. They called them executive murderers in the Biafran hinterland. And there was always clashes between colonial authorities like the police and the district officers with these masquerades who tried to enforce social obedience and social norms. Many of them were not acceptable by the colonial authorities. And it was during this period, as people became converted into Christianity, they began to reject the notion of ancestral masquerades. And you see so many fights between believers and non-believers. Some of them will even bounce on masquerades and try to tear off their costumes. And those acts were really causing serious problems. So over time, now, whether you are a convert or non-convert, it came to a point by the end of colonialism from the 50s and 60s that anybody can now get into the masquerade cult, to the masquerade societies, believers or not, educated or not, it doesn't matter. So that's what I talk about, the contemporary practices. So everybody knows now that these were not ancestors, these were human beings who were clothed in those dramatic attires to create fear and enforce social control. Okay, finally, let me re-emphasize the concept of narratology and remembering. So in the African system, both in the African diaspora, masquerade was not just a form of entertainment. Again, it was primarily a performative story of collective remembering, an effective affirmative technique of narrative engaging. It provided the participants a forum to make their grievances and their voices heard, whether they are dancing these voices or dramatizing it or verbalizing it. They were telling those in power you are oppressing us. Some of your preferences and interests are not in harmony with those of the oppressed. We need changes, we need reformation. So I started this lecture by saying that these forms of narratives were parts of the political administration. The Olaga Masquerade, for instance, will come to the public square and comment on social norms and social ills and criticize the leaders. Just like the slaves in the African diaspora, we are also doing in the Caribbeans and in the Americas during Christmas time and other opportunities they have. They mimic the elite, the European elite, criticize them, make ridicule of them, made their voices heard, lamented their situations, asking for freedom and better conditions of service. Okay, that is it. And I'm now open for questions, and I hope to use the questions to throw more light to things perhaps I didn't explain better.
That was really interesting. Thank you so much, Professor. I have a couple of questions. Early in the talk, you talked about the controversy about the language groups. Now, could you explain a little more why it is important to categorize ethnic groups in specific language groups and why it's important to categorize them correctly?
Thank you. So yeah, that's a very interesting question. In fact, 2 weeks ago, a group from London, we had this Zoom meeting also about the book as well, and they focus more on the Bantu and the language question. So you see, Bantu studies were started by the Europeans, the Portuguese, the Germans, the French, the British. And what led them to the study was that when, for instance, when the Portuguese landed in Central Africa, they came in contact with certain words, like Okoko, for instance. And when they came to some parts of West Africa, and then Eastern Africa, Southern Africa, they saw similar words, and the same words meant the same thing. So they were like, what is happening? We are talking about 2,000, 3,000 miles away. There are similarities in words, and not only similarities, they also mean the same thing. So that was how all these Bantu studies started. And then in their wisdom, they started to group the various languages so that they would be able to decipher origins of migration and how to make sense out of nearly 2,000 languages in Africa. So that was how this whole notion of language studies in Africa in terms of family of languages began. But then, as I mentioned, they were not masters of the languages. They were not speakers of the languages. And at the same time, they were making all these classifications. So you can expect mistakes. And what amazes me is that several years after all these classifications were made, we have not really, and when I say we, I mean African students of African studies, we have not really made efforts to revisit those classifications and, if possible, reclassify them based on what the native speakers know about their language and their relationships. So that was where my research began in terms of the Bantu languages. So if we are going to call the Biblio-Efik part of the Niger, part of the Congo branch of Niger Congo, and then classify Igbo as Kwa language, on what basis are you doing that? Because I know hundreds of Igbo communities in the Cross River Basin that speak almost the same language, their own brand of Igbo. I can't even understand it unless I get somebody to interpret for me. So they speak almost the same language with their neighbors. So, but you divide them between their neighbors, put their neighbors in a different family, language family, and put them in a different language family. that's why I'm saying we need to go back to those classifications. And I showed in my book, I showed a good number of words that are similar in the various classifications and which you can find in other regions in Africa. For instance, my name Njoku, I've had situations where people from Kenya come to me and say, hey, Mr. Njoku, which part of Kenya do you come from? And I found it very interesting because each time they ask me, I just laugh. And then I say, why, what makes you believe I come from Kenya? And they say, ah, we know, come on, your last name. I say, really? Njoku, yeah. I say, yeah, we know Njoku is from Kenya. I say, okay, but I'm not really from Kenya. They say, oh my God, I can't believe that. And I try to ask them, what does Njoku mean? And they say almost the same thing Njoku means in the hinterland of, Biafra. So it's very interesting how these things are realities. And at the same time, we have not spent a lot of time to wrap our heads around them and be able to, do proper study and reclassify them. I think it's a kind of intellectual laziness.
Yeah, absolutely. And I really appreciated your point about mobility of people and how people constantly were on the move before we have these, let's say, arbitrary and artificial borders that we've created. But this is not really a question, but more common because I'm working on an internal paper on mobility in Germany in the 18th and 19th in the 17th and 18th century. And what you discussed earlier in the West African context is exactly the same, which makes me wonder how erroneous it might be for us to talk about German culture or West African culture or Igbo culture, because as you said in your talk, every village was onto themselves. So even without an Igbo language group or an Igbo ethnic group or like a German ethnic group, you have so many cultural differences that vary from one small community to the next. So I think that's really fascinating and a good way to think about it and trying to understand the past as well.
Absolutely. So you see, most of the things we do, uh, we borrow from others and they borrow from us. So people have been sharing ideas, curiosities, material culture for several millennia, to the point that sometimes it's difficult to really pinpoint where one kind of culture originated and where it did not originate.
Yeah. I have one more question. I'm not sure if you're able to comment on that, but I was really intrigued by hearing about the Jonkunu Christmas time slave masquerades. How can I picture that? Do you have any idea how that looked, what it looked like?
Very interesting. So, I found that very interesting when I was doing my studies. Even the word Jonkunu has become very controversial. There are competing ideas where the word originated. One notion said from Igbo land, so another notion said from Calabar or Ibibio Efik area, another one said from the Akan, another said is a corruption of word from Native American, another said from Europe. So my whole idea is that in as much as we are grappling with this origin, again, it tells us how elements of ideas came from these various societies, European, African, Native American, Caribbean, and so on and so forth. But even the French. But the whole idea was that the Jonkonu in the Akan history or modern Ghana was supposed to be a 16th, 17th century ruler who was so flamboyant, rich, and at the same time powerful. But then the French supposedly met him in Ghana, in modern Ghana, and they established this link with him. And it was supposed to be that he came to the diaspora where he tried to they use his image or notion to rally the slaves together. So during Christmas time, this accoutrement of African dances were put together, partly to celebrate the Christmas times and partly to celebrate an indigenous ruler who was considered flamboyant, powerful, charismatic, and popular not only among the Africans, as a kind of source of pride, but also among the French elite. So again, the best way for us to understand it is a drawing of symbols from African history, European history, and the slave culture in the Caribbean and in the Americas. So that Christmas time festivity was Christian oriented, but at the same time, African oriented. And they bring together all these manners of dance and singing and jumping about, and the dresses they put together. Even when you look at some of these Jonkunu dances and masquerades, the kind of attire they wore, some of them, most of them were European fabric, but also they use certain natural fiber they could find in the Caribbean to recreate the original one they use in Africa. So, the best way to see it is that it became a name, Jonkunu became a name for the various element of culture that was brought together for this celebration. But, historical research up to today has not been able to precisely pinpoint whether really Jonkunu came from West Africa or not. It's just like talking about a legend that you cannot support with historical fact, especially when they cite the 17th century. It's supposed not to be a mystery to really locate his kingdom in West Africa, but it has remained, very fuzzy. Nobody is sure whether it is true or not.
Very interesting. Well, if you do find out the origin, please send us an email. I'd love to share that with our viewers. But Professor, I want to thank you so much for such an interesting lecture and for writing the book. I mean, that is going to be so important and so valuable for anyone who's trying to understand more about West African and Igbo traditions and how they changed over time as well. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And good luck with any future projects that you have going on.
Please, thank you very much for having me. Again, it's a pleasure to use this forum to talk about my book. I really appreciate it. It's a blessing for me, and thanks a lot.
Thank you. And thank you to all of our viewers. And I hope to see you at the next episode of the Frontier Culture Museum Lecture Series. Until then, bye-bye.